Hey. Okay, haven't found that ring light yet. We'll see. Welcome to Chapter 1, Module 1. So what you're going to see in that module is that I do cover some issues that are not covered in Chapter 1 of our book. American Government in Black and White, preferred 5th edition. So some of that you're going to find, narrated slides and so forth. Not necessarily what's in Chapter 1, although I consider it to be Chapter 1 sort of material, you know. And then some of it overlaps quite a bit with what's covered in Chapter 1 of our text. So just look for that. I cover things that they don't cover that I thought, I'd like to include that. Things like our changing racial and ethnic demographics, our changing age demographics. I cover classical liberalism like they do in the book, only I get a little more into it, maybe take a slightly different angle on it. Yeah, so just recognize, sorry about that, I gotta turn this thing off, don't I? Just keep that in mind. So this is going to be an introductory video where I kind of guide you through my take on Chapter 1. Right? And maybe I can also model sort of good reading behavior. Because I think if you're doing sort of a good read of this material, I'm going to try to demonstrate what it's like to do a good read of this material. You know, as I go through it, I'll give my thoughts. That's what you should be doing, interacting with the text in kind of the dynamic way. So, without further ado, Chapter 1. Right, our authors start out, given the title of the book, it makes sense, talking about our history here in America of slavery. And then, of course, right after the fall of slavery, as a result of the Civil War, the rise of Jim Crow and racial segregation, emphatically in the South, right, de jure by law, and then de facto in the North. Although remember, right, at the end of the Civil War, almost all black people in America lived in the South. So that's where most of the action was at that time. You get this great migration right later on, beginning in the early 20th century, of Southern blacks moving to the North for jobs, and some escape from Jim Crow and lynchings and so forth. So, right, the question that our author raised at the beginning is, what should we make of that history? You know, there's different ways to respond to that, right? Some say maybe reparations, right? Compensation for past wrongs. That's a tricky issue. It's complicated. I think there are some local governments that are starting to experiment with some form of reparations, but I would say that's an idea that hasn't yet caught fire nationally, let's put it that way. Although, you know, we do have a history of sometimes providing reparations. Arguably some form of that with Native Americans based on past wrongs, and certainly with Asian Americans as a result of the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, right? Congress appropriated money for reparations for survivors of the camps, the internment camps. I think that was 1988, 89-ish, something like that. And I know that Ronald Reagan, as president, issued the formal apology, and then Congress appropriated the money to pay for it, $20,000 per survivor. So there is precedent there. Okay, so that's one approach, right? Some say, well, maybe not reparations, but maybe things like affirmative action based on race and ethnicity as a way to remedy those historical wrongs that resonate today in the present. Because isn't that the premise of both reparations and things like affirmative action, right? Is the idea that this story isn't over yet. This trauma of slavery and Jim Crow, which again was right in place until about 1970, Jim Crow, and we struggle with it yet today, many would argue, that trauma has been handed down through the generations. Just like it, right? I have a friend who's very interested in this issue as he struggles with his own sort of situation. He thinks, okay, I've got these problems. I feel like at least some of that was because of how my parents dealt with, you know, raising me and my brother. So, you know, it makes me a little bit angry maybe towards my parents, bad choices that they made perhaps. Wait a minute, what about my mom? What was her family life like growing up? What were her parents like? Oh, they were problematic. They inflicted trauma on her, right? And then the same, maybe even more so on his dad's side. Trauma inflicted by his dad's parents. And then you could even go further back, right? Well, what about, if you're going to be hard on the grandparents, maybe it's the great-grandparents that inflicted trauma. In other words, right, it just gets passed down through the generations. It's not like you start each generation with a blank slate. Tabula rasa, as Locke would have it. Right? There's no blank slate for people. Right? We, in a sense, we inherit the past, and it lives in us today. So with social issues like slavery, right? And at the individual level, everyone can see that, I hope. My God, how could you not see that? How could you not see that? And then you just apply that logic, right, to society at large, and boom, that becomes an argument. An argument. You either find it more convincing or less convincing, but it's an argument, right, that we still bear responsibility for those past wrongs in the present because it lives in us, has been handed down, this trauma. And maybe an argument, a way to deal with that are things like reparations, perhaps affirmative action, at the very least, right, anti-discrimination laws. All right. Others would say, no, you got it all wrong. The best way we can deal with this is to talk about it less, stop measuring it all the time, de-emphasize race and ethnicity, strive to be colorblind. We don't need no stinking affirmative action. That just puts us deeper in the hole. We don't need reparations. That's all in the past. Nobody alive today had slaves. That's all in the past. Let it lie in the past and go forward in colorblind fashion. And as an argument that would argue against things like reparations and affirmative action. Although it wouldn't argue against anti-discrimination laws, right? That it will be consistent with that argument. That, we made mistakes in the past, but going forward, we're going to try to adhere to a colorblind, anti-discrimination approach. So our authors, I think, do a good job of raising exactly those issues. That's what they're trying to accomplish at the beginning. Getting us, right? All of us are students at some level. Getting us to really think about these questions. They're really important for the nation and for individuals and families and communities, right? And they kind of jump around a little bit. So, they look at the functions of government. What does government do? Now I'm switching gears, getting into the nuts and bolts. I see my lighting keeps changing. I don't know why. I'm no good at this. Functions of government, right? The government, I think all would agree at some level, needs to provide things like national security, right? Through things like our military and maybe the CIA. We live in what is ultimately, right, ask Ukraine, a hostile world, and arguably every nation needs some form of national security apparatus, including a military. Our government certainly provides that, right? By far, no one even close. The world's most powerful military times 10, or maybe more than times 10. We are so unequaled in that arena. So in that sense, right, our government's done a great job, perhaps. Protect civil rights for all, right, through things like anti-discrimination legislation that protects, blacks, Latinos, Asian Americans, Native Americans, white people, right? It protects everybody from unfair discrimination based on race and ethnicity. Civil liberties, right? Protects civil liberties, things like free speech, freedom from cruel and unusual punishments, freedom of religion, the right to keep and bear arms, and on and on, all that good Bill of Rights stuff. Provide public goods. Provide public goods. Things like perhaps the power grid, right? Tends to be a public good. Although sometimes, right, there's cooperation with private businesses as well, and to me that's fine. Vaccines, right, was a public good provided by the Trump administration to we the people for COVID, and then of course that baton taken up by President Biden. Again, in cooperation, right, in many cases with private actors like Big Pharma. That's often how these models work, by the way. Government works often in concert with private enterprise to provide public goods. clean air, clean water. Because sometimes the government has to be a little bit, again, sorry for the changes in light, has to sometimes, right, be adversarial with private enterprise. Because sometimes private enterprise, to maximize profit, right, they take shortcuts. If it's cheaper to dispose of their toxic byproducts in rivers and lakes and just in the air, they'll do that because it's, cheap. But right, government's obligation then, right, is to step in and say, no, you're ruining our air and our water. It's profitable for you, but bad for everybody else. We're going to put regulations on that through the Environmental Protection Agency, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, public goods. So sometimes conflict, right, between government and private enterprise, sometimes cooperation. And it's also, right, that intense question. What is a public good? Where does government have a responsibility? Where does it not have a responsibility? What about housing? Does government have a responsibility to provide affordable housing? Is that a public good? Some would say yes, absolutely. Others would say, oh, hell no. If you want a living space, you better earn it in maybe in a private market or whatever. What about education? Is that a public good? Or should it all be private? Fierce contests over that, right? How much should government subsidize higher education, if at all? Or the state, right? State or Fed, same basic question. What about health care? Is that an appropriate, is that an appropriate public good? I'm all washed out. Oh, I know what's happening. Sorry about that. It's this little thing. It's this. Sorry. It's that fluorescent bulb. Okay. Yeah, healthcare. Should government, like through the Affordable Care Act, subsidize that, or should they not? Is it a fundamental human right, or is it not? Fierce questions about that. And then, related to that, services. Right, postal services, U.S. Postal Service. The Veterans Administration, right, provides health care to veterans. And this overlaps with provision of goods. Transportation, right, highways and airports and so forth. What role for the government? Mental health services, Social Security, right? And notably, right, there's often fierce debates over what is a public good and what's not a public good. What should the government be involved in providing and what should it not be involved in providing? And if they are going to play a role in providing some sort of public good or service, what exactly should that role be? And should they subsidize it a lot or just a little? That comes up all the time, right, with education, especially higher education. Should we have free community college or is that over the top? All right. So I think they do a good job with that. So what are some? So we consider ourselves, right, to be. Now moving on here, next stage of this discussion, and this should track, with what's covered in Chapter 1. We are a constitutional democracy. Right? There's a collection of constitutional democracies across the globe. There are many countries that are not that. But we certainly are, and we're in league with a lot of other countries, like let's say France or Great Britain, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, etc. But not countries like China or Russia or Cuba. Those are emphatically not constitutional democracies. More's the pity. What are some principles of constitutional democracies? Ultimate power in the hands of we the people. Ultimate power in the hands of we the people. Now, direct power, we would say no, right? We don't have direct democracy. We're a nation of over 300 million people. The idea of direct democracy, right, is mechanically insane. You couldn't do it. Logistically, it's unattainable. It would be chaos, anarchy. So instead, right, we have indirect democracy. We the people do have ultimate power, you can argue, but they ultimately elect representatives on their behalf, like in Congress, right? Or the Nevada legislature, the presidency, the governorship, city councils, school boards, on and on. A written constitution, typically. Now, Britain doesn't have one. There's always an exception, There's always that one kid. Britain, right, does not have a written constitution, but they do have an unwritten one. They've developed a constitution sort of on the fly through historical practices that are, very real, but not necessarily written down in a specific governing document. But we do, right, we're more typical of a constitutional democracy. We have a written constitution. Rules of the game. Right. Including, by the way, not just power to the people, but limits on power to the people, right? Limits. Because we have in that Constitution, don't we, a Bill of Rights. And that says, look, no matter how unpopular your speech, the majority cannot take that away from you. Unless, there are always going to be exceptions, like child pornography or shouting fire in a crowded movie theater, and then a few other categories. Okay. Free and fair elections. Free and fair elections. Which we have. Contrary to insane claims beginning in 2016, continuing in 2018 and 2020, and we'll see about 2022, but it's going to be more of the same. I think that's obvious in 2024. I worry about that. There are increasingly voices that say our elections are neither free nor fair. That's not supported by any plausible evidence. Let's be very clear about that. Some things are ambiguous, other things are very clear. This is very clear. Right? And obviously, the elephant in the room here is Donald Trump and some of his allies who have basically taken the position, when you boil it down, right? If Trump, and especially Trump, and his chosen allies, if they don't win, that was not a free and fair election. Well, that's not how you determine, right, whether or not you have free and fair elections. We can't use that as the criteria. If Trump wins, it's free and fair. If Trump loses, it's unfree and unfair. That can't be the way we define free and fair elections. So that is an ill that we currently suffer from, right? Because that's become a widespread belief among many Americans, an article of faith, indicating their loyalty to Donald Trump as a sort of a cult figure. We're struggling with that, aren't we? It's a very real thing. At some level, to me, it seems like clinical insanity, but whether it is or isn't, here it is. It's a very real thing. So we struggle with that. And other countries that are democratic are having similar struggles. This is a tough time for democracy. Democracies are far from perfect, but they're better than the alternatives, let me tell you. An independent media. There's many things that are problematic about our media. You don't have to sell me on that idea. But ultimately, right, you want a media not controlled by the government. So, the media might sometimes do toxic things, but the premise here is, all right, that's going to happen. Although that's become increasingly problematic. That's a different story for a different day. But what's important is the government not control those media outlets, even if they're behaving badly. As long as they're not behaving badly at the behest of the government, that's acceptable in a constitutional democracy. The protection of fundamental rights and liberties, Bill of Rights stuff. Yeah, and look, so those are the broad principles. Right now, each country will approach those things in their own unique way. Right? We have our way here in America, our own special sauce. Other countries that are equally democratic, or in some cases, quite honestly, more democratic, they're going to have, a somewhat different take. Although all of these principles, they're all on board with. They just have a somewhat different approach at the level of detail. And that's fine. It's fine. All right. Some other principles here that our authors talk about. The rule of law. Right, the rule of law as a fundamental principle of a constitutional democracy. And that's to distinguish, right, from rule by an arbitrary individual who can do whatever he or she wants to do. Right, Russia has rule not by law, but by Vladimir Putin. North Korea doesn't have rule by law, but rule by, I always forget that guy's name, that dude. Right, arbitrary and capricious. So we strive to avoid that. Now again, Trump is a counterexample, right? He said, no, not rule by law, rule by what I want at any one moment in time. I don't even remember, but he had pardoned, which actually he's certainly permitted to do by the Constitution. We'll get into that. But presidents have a very sort of an untrammeled pardon power under Article 2 language. And Trump said, I'm going to maximize that. I'm going to pardon all of my political allies, no matter what they've done, and I won't pardon my political enemies. That's not really rule of law. I mean, in a formal sense it is, because he's exercising legal powers given to him by Article 2. But it violates, right, that principle of rule by law. That the law should apply to everybody equally. And it should not be arbitrary and capricious. Trump's all about being arbitrary and capricious. He made no bones about that. And some people like that. You might like that. I would just say, fine, or maybe not fine, but okay. But that's not consistent with a basic principle of a constitutional democracy. Sometimes I think we're fed up with constitutional democracy. We're like, to hell with it. We want, some form of a superhero to come in and rescue us from ourselves. And some have said that's Donald Trump. I would just say, resist that. Whatever political ideology you subscribe to, try to resist that. It can be tempting, but resist it, because it means you're straying from a basic principle of a constitutional democracy. And look, as our authors point out, do we have a history of often not ruling by rule of law? Absolutely, right? Have we often been arbitrary and capricious? Absolutely, right? Slavery, discrimination against Asian Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, women, and with lots of deviations from the rule of law there. But we've gotten better, although right now, arguably, we're backsliding. It's tough. Another principle, natural law. Right? We are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That might sound familiar because it's from the Declaration of Independence. Right? That we are endowed by our Creator. Now look, that Creator, to some people, might be a God. It might be multiple gods. It might be the spirit world. It might be Charles Darwin. Right? That's why our founders kept it at that level of generality. Right? They say, whoever you think your Creator is, once you're born, essentially, once you become a human, you are endowed by certain fundamental rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that's also encoded in our Bill of Rights. If you look at that Ninth Amendment, which few people do, you'll notice it says something akin to, okay, these, all the foregoing rights, Amendments 1 through 8, those are the ones that we've specified here that you have. But that doesn't mean there aren't other rights possessed by we the people. Right? That's a non-comprehensive listing. That's really a statement of natural law, right? Because it's that broader notion of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that can justify, right, as it did for John Locke, civil disobedience. Right? Because you could argue, look, we've passed laws, we are using rule of law, but sometimes the rule of law is bullshit, right? Slavery was rule of law in a way, right? It was encoded into law. Just saying rule of law doesn't mean therefore it's gonna be correct. Sometimes you can pass deeply unjust laws. Slavery, easy peasy call on that. All right, so it gets tricky. So natural law would say you might have slavery encoded into law, but that doesn't mean it's legitimate, because it's in conflict with natural law, which is that universally we are endowed with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Universally. So it creates that, right, that critical edge that allows we the people to engage in civil disobedience. Now, when it's correct to do that and when it's not is often an open question, contested, right? And how far should that civil disobedience go? And what if it bleeds over into violence? Well, that no longer fits, right, the concept of civil disobedience. And then related to that, natural rights. All right. Again, those things that you find in the Bill of Rights. All right. Our authors also talk about classical liberalism. I cover that in some slides in this module. I go into it in more detail. Take a look at those. This is essentially some of those ideas given to us by people like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Adam Smith, Thomas Hume, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Jeremy Bentham, and so on. A number of things here, right? The importance of the individual and individual freedom, the importance of limits on government, limited government, the importance of private property, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of property is what John Locke said. Jefferson later amended that to say life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to make it more universal. Especially back then, not many people could actually pursue property. And free markets. Right, free market, a relatively free market economy. And also reason before faith. Reason before faith, right? Very characteristic of the Enlightenment. That's what classical liberalism is, right? Ideas generated by philosophers in what's called the era of Enlightenment, mostly the 17th and 18th centuries. Reason over faith. That's the beginning of what we see today, right? America is becoming much more secular, much less religious. The same is true, only typically more so, for other Western democracies. They're further down that road than we are. And look, you might think it's good or bad. I don't know. It's above my pay grade. But I would say, right, we are on a trend towards secularization. No question. That has an impact on our politics. And is all rooted in that 18th century Enlightenment, where the founders argued, or the founders and those who influenced them argued, right, that ultimately reason is more important than faith. That we determine good government through reason, not through the Bible or faith. I mean, we create a lot of room for faith. Don't get me wrong, my gosh, and we respect it, right? Look at the First Amendment: freedom of and from religion, both of and from religion. It's very important, was important to the Founding Fathers. But ultimately, when you're engaged in governance, man, you got to go with reason over faith. Although faith might inform your reason, but reason over faith. Our authors argue that, well, classical liberalism, probably a little closer to today's Republican Party versus the Democratic Party. Maybe. That's an interesting claim. To unpack that would take many hours. We're not going to do that, but that's an interesting claim. I see some of their reasoning. And when you think about limited government, right, you sometimes think of Republicans. But look at the recent issue of abortion. There, the Republicans want unlimited government to criminalize all abortions. That's not consistent. It's complicated, but they make that claim. I see the reasoning. And then second, right, classical republicanism, another element of our constitutional democracy. Classical republicanism, there the focus is less on the individual and more on the community, right? What's good for the community, what's good for the group. The emphasis is on being civically virtuous, on doing what's good for the community, not just the individual. Think about vaccines, right? Think about Republicans versus Democrats. I'm simplifying here, but basically, right, Republicans said, if an individual wants to do it, that's up to them, and if they don't, that's the end of the story. Individual freedom, right? And Democrats are a little more like, don't be selfish, be civically virtuous. You might not need the vaccine, but if you get it, that might help protect some of your fellow Americans, especially the elderly or those with chronic medical conditions. Civic virtue, right? Republicanism. That's a little more of a Democratic Party thing, perhaps. Again, that's what our authors claim. I see the reasoning, but you don't want to go too far with that, but maybe. Often the emphasis is on the group over the individual, but the individual still matters to a classical Republican, but group over the individual, rule through elected representatives, not direct democracy. And private property is still important in this tradition. Separation of powers, right? Executive, legislative, judicial, state and national, state and local. Separate those powers, spread it around. And our authors argue, right, well, we're a combination of both, right? We're a combination of Republicans and Democrats, classical liberalism and classical republicanism. It's all part of our tradition of building a constitutional democracy. Yes. So we draw upon both of those traditions. We draw upon both. And maybe classical liberalism is closer to today's Republican Party, and maybe classical republicanism is closer to today's Democratic Party. Watch the language, right? When we say classical liberalism, that's not modern day liberals like, I don't know, Joe Biden. It's a broader set of ideas. Same for classical republicanism, right? It's a broad set of ideas. Don't confuse it with today's Republican Party. There's overlap, but differences. All right. And our authors also emphasize, and I cover this in some detail in a different part of this module, narrated slides, a tradition of inegalitarianism. That's also part of our founding, right? Right up to the present. We struggle with that, don't we? Whether it's in the form of slavery, or Jim Crow, or interning Japanese Americans after Pearl Harbor, or our grotesque treatment of Native Americans in history, or our treatment of Jews, women, Latinos. Tough, man. Every country struggles with this, and we are no different. We just have our own special sauce of inegalitarianism, deeply rooted in most of our history. And it reverberates right up to today. And then we struggle with what to do about that. That's how we began the chapter, and that's how we'll end it. Dang. Yeah. And then our authors go into some detail there over that history and why it came about. Right? It's about power, straight up, right? Because, at the beginning, early days of the American experiment, pre-1776, we're talking 1600s, there were white slaves here and also black slaves from Africa. But over time, we racialized slavery and said, no, black slaves should be sort of cordoned off in their own special situation. They look different from us. They come from Africa. They don't have the same religious traditions that we have. They don't have the same culture. Whereas the white slaves that we had originally, a lot of them, right, same language, same culture, same religious beliefs as white owners. So we ultimately decided, let's racialize slavery. And so by 1619, we had begun to racialize slavery with a vengeance. And by about 1680 or so, that had become increasingly the way that we did things. We can treat black slaves as slaves because they're so different from us, and it's economically advantageous for white people in power. And we can, get rid of the category of white slaves. Maybe indentured servants for a time, but no more than that because we share a lot of traits with them. So that's the case with our race and slavery. It started out as kind of a non-racial institution, but we pretty quickly racialized it here in America, and it reverberates today. And we struggle with that, don't we? And our authors have a great pie chart there. Pie. I'm actually pretty hungry. Pie. They have a pie chart on page 23 of that 5th edition. Figure 1.1, for those who might be using an older edition, right? They specify what were the categories of people at the beginning of the American experiment in 1776? Well, 1789, I guess, when we got the Constitution ratified. Because the Declaration says, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union. The question is, right, begging to be answered, who's we the people? Who's at the center of this? Who governs? Well, at the beginning, right, under the terms of the Constitution and as enacted by the states, propertied white guys over the age of 21. And back then, property was not widely held. So it is estimated that about 6% of us could vote at the beginning. 6%. And that just emphasizes, right, our tradition of inegalitarianism. We initially construe we the people, in terms of who counts the most, as about 6% of us, which at the time was considered to be radically democratic. It put us out there as, wow, those people are really pushing the envelope. They consider we the people to be 6% of the population. That's good. By those standards, we were cutting edge. Today we would say, well, damn, we got to do better than that. 6%? Oh, my Lord. So obviously, right, in some ways, that has been right our struggle to grow the 6%. Those over 20, those over 18 now, to grow that, and that's what we've done. Okay, went on way too long. Sorry about that. That's a good introduction to chapter 1 of our book. Look at the other material as well. It all adds up to the same thing. Core ideas and material to get us started. Thanks.